Halloween, a night meant for harmless scares, costumes, and candy. But what if some frights weren't just fun and games? Tonight, I'll share a chilling experience from my childhood, a Halloween night that left me with nightmares. Are you ready to hear the story of the man with the stroller? It was Halloween, a night that held the promise of mystery and adventure. I was about 8 years old, and the whole year I had waited eagerly for this one night, the chance to dress up, venture out into the chilly October air, and fill my pillowcase with candy. This Halloween was particularly special because for the first time, my mom had decided I was old enough to trick or treat without her supervision. She dropped me off at my friend Sean's house, where we would set off with another friend, Johnny. The thought of exploring the neighborhood on our own filled me with both excitement and a small nagging fear that I brushed off, eager for the night to begin. Sean's house itself always struck me as a bit eerie. It was old, with creaky wooden floors and dim lighting that seemed to throw shadows in all the wrong places. Sean's family was quiet and reserved, and his older sister, who was almost an adult, was often home but rarely acknowledged us. She would hover in the background, ghost-like, moving from one room to another with barely a word. That night, she was as aloof as ever, hardly looking up from her book as we bounded out the door, pillowcases in hand, ready for our Halloween adventure. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, the air grew cold, biting against our cheeks and noses. A light mist had started to roll in, softening the outlines of the houses and casting an otherworldly glow over the streets. The neighborhood was alive with other kids in costumes, their laughter echoing down the sidewalks. We joined the crowd, our steps quick and eager, stopping at each house and shouting, "Trick or treat," as we held out our pillowcases. With each house, our bags grew heavier, the weight of the candy inside making me feel like we were true adventurers, gathering treasure in a world of magic and mystery. After an hour or so, we ventured further from Sean's house, following the faint glow of streetlights down streets we hadn't been to before. The houses here were older, larger, and set farther back from the street, with tall trees whose branches reached out like skeletal fingers. The number of trick-or-treaters had thinned out, and we found ourselves walking alone, the laughter and chatter of other children now distant echoes. It was then that we noticed him, a man trailing behind us, pushing a stroller. He walked slowly, his steps measured and steady, as if he were in no hurry at all. The stroller was covered with a thick dark blanket, hiding whatever, or whoever, was inside. He seemed harmless enough at first glance, just another parent out with his child, but there was something about him that felt wrong. Maybe it was the way he seemed to blend into the shadows, or the way his head tilted slightly downward, his face obscured by a hat. Or perhaps it was the way he hummed softly to himself, a low, eerie tune that didn't quite fit the festive atmosphere of the night. Every time I glanced back, he was there, maintaining a steady distance but never falling behind. The faint hum of his tune drifted toward us, almost like a lullaby, soft and haunting. It was the kind of melody that you might hear in a dream or a nightmare. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I glanced at Sean and Johnny to see if they felt it too. Johnny, always the brave one, shrugged it off, his gaze fixed on the next house. As we reached the end of a street, the man finally spoke, his voice smooth and oddly calm. "How's the trick-or-treating going, boys?" he asked, his gaze flicking between us, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. We mumbled polite responses, unsure of what to make of him. His presence felt intrusive, almost as if he were prying into our little group, trying to break through our innocent excitement with something darker. Then he made an offer that sent a ripple of unease through me. "Why don't you come to my house?" he said, a slow smile creeping across his face. "I have plenty of leftover candy and it's just up the road." Johnny, eager and always up for an adventure, looked intrigued. He glanced at me and Sean, his eyes alight with the thought of more candy. "Come on," he urged. "Let's go check it out." His voice was filled with excitement, but there was something in his tone that didn't sit right with me. A hint of forced bravery, perhaps, or maybe just the innocent thrill of getting to explore a stranger's house. Sean and I exchanged a glance, and I could tell he felt the same unease I did. But curiosity, mixed with the allure of more candy, won out, and we followed the man, keeping a few steps behind. He led us down a winding path, away from the main road, and the houses became sparser, their lights dimmer. The shadows here were long and dark, stretching across the street like black tendrils. His footsteps were soft, almost soundless, and the faint humming continued, drifting back toward us like a ghostly lullaby. His house appeared at the end of the street, shrouded in darkness. It was large and imposing, with tall windows that seemed to peer down at us like eyes. The trees around it were bare, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers, casting eerie shadows across the lawn. The porch light was dim, barely illuminating the front steps, and the door itself was old and weathered, the paint peeling in places. He unlocked the door and held it open, gesturing for us to step inside. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the walls lined with portraits whose faces were shadowed and obscured, their eyes seeming to follow us as we walked past. I felt a strange sense of foreboding, a weight pressing down on my chest that made it hard to breathe. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint scent of something sweet and sickly, like candy left out too long. As we ventured deeper into the house, the man closed the door behind us, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. A strange stillness settled over the place, a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Sean, who had been quiet all this time, glanced over at the stroller, his gaze lingering on the blanket that covered whatever lay inside. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Sean reached out, lifting the edge of the blanket. In an instant, his face went pale, his eyes widening in horror. He looked back at us, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to go. Now." Without a second thought, we turned and ran, our footsteps echoing through the house as we bolted toward the door. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions, but all I could think of was getting out. As we burst through the door and into the night, we didn't stop running until we reached the end of the street. A woman from a nearby house saw us and hurried over, her face filled with concern. We told her everything, our words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She listened, her expression growing more serious, and without a word, she led us to her car and drove us home. That night we recounted the entire experience to our parents, who called the police, but by the time they arrived at the house, the man, and whatever was in the stroller, had vanished without a trace. To this day, I wonder what Sean saw under that blanket, and every Halloween the memory of that night haunts me, filling me with a lingering sense of dread. If this story gave you chills, don't let the terror end here. Hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this nightmare with friends who think they can handle it. But beware. Some stories are best left in the shadows. It was Halloween night in 2016, and unlike the Halloweens of my childhood, this one held a strange quietness. I was in college by this time, and while most of my friends were off at Halloween parties or busy with their own plans, I had decided to spend the evening at home. My parents were out, leaving me with the responsibility of handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters in our quiet neighborhood. Our house was nestled in a cul-de-sac at the edge of a peaceful, tree-lined street. Usually, we didn't get a lot of trick-or-treaters, and most of the families around here kept to themselves. Despite this, my mom had stocked up on an excessive amount of candy, insisting that we'd need it just in case. I had been munching on leftover treats between doorbells, the chocolate already starting to feel heavy in my stomach. The evening passed quietly, with only a few scattered groups of kids coming by. I could hear their laughter echoing down the street as they moved from house to house, their excitement a reminder of the Halloweens I used to enjoy. But tonight, something felt off. The usual energy of Halloween felt muted, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around 9:30 p.m. the doorbell rang, and I felt a slight shiver of surprise. It was late for trick-or-treaters, especially in our neighborhood. By this time, most of the houses had turned off their porch lights, signaling that the night was over. Vito, our small but fiercely loyal terrier, began barking, his little body vibrating with excitement and perhaps a bit of agitation. Curious, I approached the door, peering through the peephole. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. Standing on the other side was a figure dressed as a clown, not the friendly, jolly kind of clown, but something much darker. The costume was elaborate, with oversized shoes and a brightly colored suit, but the face was something else entirely. The mask was grotesque, painted in a twisted grin that seemed to stretch too wide, the teeth exaggerated and yellowed. The eyes were dark, hollow, almost as if they absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. He was holding a brown sack in one hand, holding it out as though expecting candy. But there was something off about his stance, something that set my nerves on edge. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle, every instinct in my body screaming not to open it. But after a moment, I cracked the door open slightly, just enough to say, "Sorry, we're out of candy," hoping he'd take the hint and leave. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. But he didn't move. He just stood there silent, staring at me through the dark eye holes of his mask. His breathing was slow and steady, each exhale sending a small cloud of condensation into the cool night air. The silence stretched on, growing thicker with each passing second, until I couldn't take it any longer. I closed the door quickly, locking it and stepping back, my heart racing. A few seconds passed, and then the doorbell rang again, the sound piercing the quiet night like a knife. Vito's barking intensified, his little body almost vibrating with the effort. I felt a growing sense of dread, my pulse quickening as I stood there, unsure of what to do. I stayed where I was, frozen, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the storm door being forced open. There was a loud crack as the latch snapped, the noise echoing through the hallway. Panic surged through me, my hands shaking as I backed away from the door. I glanced at Vito, who was still barking furiously, his eyes fixed on the door as though he could sense the danger lurking on the other side. Without thinking, I scooped him up and darted up the stairs, my mind racing. I turned off the lights as I went, hoping that the darkness would give the impression that no one was home. Once I reached the top of the stairs, I slipped into my bedroom, closing the door behind me and locking it. My hands were trembling, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat reverberating through my body. In the silence that followed, I strained my ears, listening for any sign that he had left. Minutes passed, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. Just as I began to let myself relax, convincing myself that he must have given up, I heard a faint tapping at my bedroom window. My blood ran cold. My bedroom was on the second floor, and there was no possible way for anyone to reach the window without a ladder. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. The tapping continued, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo through the room, filling the silence with a growing sense of dread. Slowly, almost unwillingly, I turned toward the window, my heart pounding so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pulled back the curtain, just enough to catch a glimpse of what lay on the other side. There he was, the clown, his grotesque mask pressed against the glass, his dark eyes locked onto mine. He tilted his head slightly, as though examining me, the twisted grin on his mask stretched wide. For a moment, I felt as though I were staring into the face of a nightmare, a creature born of darkness and malice. A scream tore from my throat, and I stumbled backward, clutching Vito tightly as I tried to put as much distance between myself and the window as possible. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a moment to grab my phone. I dialed 911, my voice barely steady as I whispered to the operator, explaining that there was a man at my window, that I was alone, that I was terrified. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, the sound almost drowning out everything else. The tapping continued, relentless, each tap sending a jolt of fear through me. I whispered to Vito, trying to calm him, but my own terror was too palpable to hide. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens approaching, their wailing echoing through the quiet neighborhood. A wave of relief washed over me, and I let out a shaky breath, my grip on Vito loosening slightly. The police arrived, their flashlights illuminating the yard as they searched the area. But by the time they reached the house, the clown was gone. All they found was the broken latch on the storm door and, disturbingly, a ladder propped against the side of the house, right beneath my bedroom window. The realization sent a shiver through me, the thought of him standing there, staring into my room, watching me in the dark. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but every Halloween since, I double-lock the doors, close all the curtains, and make sure every window is shut tight. I've learned that sometimes the monsters aren't just in our imaginations. They're out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What would you do if you were in my place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has you on edge, don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and turn on the notification bell for more chilling tales. It was the weekend before Halloween, and my friends and I were itching to find the perfect party. Halloween itself was on a Tuesday that year, so the big celebrations were happening on Saturday night. We'd been looking forward to it for weeks, our costumes prepared, our spirits high. We wanted a night to remember, something thrilling and a bit wild, but what we got was something far darker than we could have ever imagined. Our group consisted of 4 close friends, me, Kate, Shauna, and Tracy. We'd been best friends since high school, and Halloween had always been one of our favorite times of year. This year, though, we hadn't made any concrete plans. Everywhere seemed to be booked up, and we were scrambling to find somewhere to go at the last minute. Kate, ever resourceful and a bit bolder than the rest of us, posted on her Instagram story, asking if anyone knew of a good party happening that night. Not long after, she got a reply from someone we knew vaguely, a guy named Dylan, who was in our extended social circle. He mentioned a party happening at a house a town over, a place supposedly owned by his friend Luke. He sent over the details, including the address, and said it would be a big event with plenty of people, music, and drinks. He even added a few rules. It was to be indoors only, no backyard access, and you had to bring your own booze. The whole setup seemed normal enough, and we were all too eager to get the night started. Between the 4 of us, we gathered our things and got ready at Shauna's house, sharing makeup, fixing each other's costumes, and laughing as we prepared. Shauna had her parents' house to herself, so we pre-gamed a bit before calling an Uber to take us to the address Dylan had sent. By the time we arrived, the streets were dark, with only the occasional flicker of porch lights casting faint pools of light on the ground. We pulled up to a large, imposing house set back from the road, surrounded by trees that cast long shadows across the lawn. The house was dimly lit, with only a few orange lights strung up along the porch, giving it an eerie glow. As we walked up to the door, the faint thumping of bass grew louder, but it was muted, almost as if it were deliberately kept low. We exchanged glances, feeling a strange sense of anticipation mixed with an unspoken hesitation. But we shrugged it off, attributing it to the Halloween vibe, and knocked on the door. A man opened it, an older man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, who introduced himself as John. He claimed to be the father of the party's host, Luke, and invited us in with a wide grin. He seemed overly eager, his smile stretched a bit too wide, and his eyes holding an unsettling intensity. We hesitated for a moment, exchanging glances, but he waved us in, gesturing toward the main room where the party was supposedly happening. The house was dimly lit, with only a few scattered orange and purple lights casting a strange glow over the room. It was spacious, yet oddly empty, with minimal furniture and just a few decorations. The whole setup felt a bit off, as though someone had tried to recreate a party scene from memory, but had missed some essential details. The music was low, the bass barely vibrating through the floor, and there were fewer people than we had expected, their faces obscured by the shadows and the dim lighting. As we moved further into the room, John reappeared, asking if we wanted to put our drinks in the kitchen. He seemed eager to help, his hands reaching out to take the bottles from us with a practiced ease. There was something about his presence that made my skin prickle, a faint sense of unease that I tried to ignore. After all, we were here to have fun, and he was just being a good host, or so I told myself. John led us to the kitchen, where there were 3 large coolers filled with ice. Each cooler already had a variety of drinks in it, and he encouraged us to add ours to the mix. I placed my drink inside, glancing around at the sparse, oddly sterile kitchen. The counters were bare, the cabinets closed tightly, and the only other item on the counter was a large bowl of ice, as though everything had been meticulously arranged for this specific night. As we settled into the party, John continued to hover nearby, greeting other guests as they arrived, though his attention always seemed to drift back to our group. He was friendly, overly so, almost as if he were trying too hard to make us feel welcome. His interactions felt rehearsed, his laughter a bit too loud, his eyes lingering on us a little too long. The 4 of us tried to brush off the strange feeling, joining a game of beer pong with some other guests who seemed equally uneasy. They laughed a bit too loudly, their smiles strained, and there was a tension in the air that made me feel like we were all sharing the same unspoken suspicion. As we continued the game, John suddenly called out our names from the kitchen, his voice loud and cheerful. "Come over here, ladies. Shots on me," he shouted, holding up a bottle of tequila. There was something forced in his enthusiasm, something that felt almost predatory, but Shauna nudged me, shrugging it off as harmless fun. Reluctantly, we made our way to the kitchen, where John poured out 4 shots, his grin widening as he pushed the glasses toward us. I glanced at my friends, feeling a wave of unease wash over me, but the tension in the air, combined with the tequila, made me question my own instincts. Maybe it was just the Halloween vibe. Maybe I was just overthinking. We each took a shot, the burn of the tequila masking the strange taste that lingered on my tongue. My head felt a bit foggy, my thoughts slipping away like sand through my fingers. I glanced at my friends, and I could see the same dazed expression in their eyes. We stumbled back to the beer pong table, our movements slow and uncoordinated, our laughter quieter, almost forced. As the night wore on, my vision blurred, the edges of the room fading into darkness. I remember snippets, a hand on my shoulder, a whispered voice, the feeling of being watched. My head felt heavy, my thoughts muddled, and I struggled to stay upright, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The last clear memory I have is of Shauna's worried face, her hand gripping my arm as she whispered, "We need to go, now." Her voice was tight, filled with fear, and I felt a jolt of panic as I tried to focus on her face. Everything was spinning, the lights dimming, and I felt myself being pulled away, my vision fading to black. The next thing I remember is waking up in the back seat of a car, my head pounding, my vision blurred. Shauna was in the front seat, her face pale, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Tracy and Kate were beside me, both of them still groggy, their faces filled with confusion and fear. We were silent, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. As we drove, Shauna finally broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. He kept asking for you," she said, her voice trembling. "He kept saying he wanted to see you again, that you were his favorite." A shiver ran down my spine, the words settling in my mind like poison. I glanced at my phone, the screen lighting up with a message from an unknown number. It was from John, a series of texts that made my stomach churn. "Where are you? You left too soon. I still have something for you." The words felt like a punch to the gut, the realization sinking in that we had narrowly escaped something far worse. We reported everything to the police, recounting every detail we could remember. But when they investigated the house, they discovered it was vacant, abandoned for months. There was no Luke, no party host, just John, lurking in the shadows, preying on unsuspecting guests. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were, and I don't want to imagine what could have happened if we hadn't left. Every Halloween since, I've felt a lingering unease, a shadow that follows me, a reminder of the night we barely escaped. If this story left you unsettled, don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and turn on the notification bell for more terrifying tales. Halloween is more than just a night for costumes and candy. Sometimes it's a reminder that real monsters walk among us.